Hello everyone. Welcome to the 70 sessions for track 7. For this talk, we have Rebecca Cantor, the head of education from Roblox, and Dan White, the chief executive officer from Filament Games. Today, they're going to talk about the future of digital robotics and the Metaverse. So let's now welcome Rebecca and Dan to take over the stage and begin their session.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. Hello, everybody. As she mentioned, I'm Dan White. I'm the CEO at Filament Games, joined by my colleague Rebecca Cantor, the head of education at Roblox. And today we're going to be doing kind of a deep dive into what the future of digital robotics looks like, and also at the same time, what it looks like what the future of learning and education on the metaverse looks like via Roblox. So it's a bit of an eclectic mix here. It's going to be super futuristic, but also like happening right now, which is super cool. These are all things that are happening right now and coming soon to a classroom near you. So let's dive right in. Rebecca, if you want to say a couple words about Roblox.
Sure, happy to. Thanks so much to everyone for joining. For anyone who's unaware, Roblox is a major online platform that brings people together through play, through millions of co-experiences online where folks are able to play, learn, explore together. So that's what we're all about. And Dan, you can go ahead.
Cool. So Filament Games has been around for 17 years. We exclusively develop games for learning and positive impact. Across that time, we've developed a lot of different games about a lot of different educational subjects. And the main thing about our methodology is that we try not to tell people things. We try to let them play with concepts. So unlike a typical video game development company, we care both about what happens to the player during the play experience, but then of course also after. So how did we change them in some longitudinal, ideally way? How did we create skills, mindsets, abilities, perspectives that translate from that gameplay space into the world, the real world outside of that gameplay space? So as promised, today we're going to be talking about two different ways that we are working to digitize robotics education right now. But before I dive into that, I wanted to give everybody, as a foundation for this discussion, a brief primer on learning games at large, because learning games can be a lot of different things. So I always like to start with this dichotomy. It's useful for framing your high-level understanding of the learning game space. And one could argue that most learning games kind of fall into one of these two general categories, basically games that deliver information and games that deliver experiences. And of course, like all dichotomies, if you really dig into it, it's really more of a spectrum. So I like to talk about it in terms of this spectrum from declarative knowledge to procedural knowledge. And over on the right-hand side, you also see a bunch of sort of non-game-based learning proxies in the education pedagogy system. So learning methodologies that can be mapped onto the right side of this spectrum as well to help you get a sense of where those types of experiences live. And most of you probably are familiar with what the game-based learning looks like more on the on the left-hand side of the spectrum. This is more of your kind of drill or practice type games where the game mechanic may be somewhat divorced from the actual content that it's trying to teach and is really just more there to create an entertainment factor. But not a lot of people are really familiar with what things look like over on the right side of the spectrum. So essentially, like, what is the game-based learning analog to project-based learning? So to talk about that, I'd like to introduce somebody named James Paul Gee, who was my advisor in graduate school. A lot of people consider him kind of the father of the modern game-based learning movement. You should definitely check out some of his books if you haven't. And he basically refines Einstein's concept of learning equals experience into learning equals something called situated understanding. And all that is, it's a fancy term to say that situated understanding is basically an understanding of something that is grounded in direct experience with that thing, as opposed to an abstract understanding. So if you all remember in the day before cell phones and GPS, when we had to ask people for directions on how to get places, the direction giver always had this situated understanding because they've lived it through firsthand experience. They've walked that route a number of times. And as they describe it to you, they're describing it to you from the perspective of somebody who has that situated understanding. But of course, for you as somebody with only verbal understanding, it just kind of ends up, as soon as you get past like 3 directions, it ends up being kind of gobbledygook and you just kind of nod politely. And then after you finish talking to that person, ask somebody else for directions in the next 3 steps, or you walk the next 3 steps and then you ask somebody else for directions, because it hasn't really stuck, because you need that firsthand experience to truly understand. So if you look back to the dawn of the learning game space, and this is, going back to late 70s, early 80s, you'll see that there's this kind of that dichotomy forming from the very beginning that I talked about early on with Einstein's quote. So some are kind of delivering games that deliver these situated understandings that I've circled here, and then others are more practice assessment of flat content. And this isn't a value statement. It's not like one's good and one's bad. It's just that the games that focus more on the flat content delivery are just not particularly impactful from a pedagogical perspective. So what does a modern situated understanding game look like? I like to use the example of Kerbal Space Program. This is one example of where I wish that I was there in person, because I would ask you all how many people have played or are familiar with Kerbal, and you'd raise your hands, so I'd have a sense of your level of game literacy. But in brief, Kerbal is basically a game where you can experiment with rocket science, which, believe it or not, people actually do for fun. And in the game, you can build essentially any kind of rocket ship you can imagine. You can send it into space. You kind of learn through trial and error what works and what doesn't work. And unlike traditional media like books, the cool thing about an experience like this is that it helps learners build these mental models, which I've represented through the blocks, the little shapes down at the bottom. It helps them build these mental models via this first-hand kind of lived experience with a very deep problem space. On the other hand, like trying to internalize content knowledge in the absence of a conceptual understanding like that is really, really hard for the human brain to do. So if you just pick up a book and you start trying to read about rocket science, most of it's probably just going to kind of bounce harmlessly off of your brain, because you don't have the mental models that are prepared to receive that kind of information. You don't have that context. But after you play a game like Kerbal, and you've literally like played with rocket science, you begin to grasp these fundamentals and start to think like a rocket scientist, which makes it so that you're better able to absorb that information. So basically, if you want to learn something like rocket science, my advice is don't start with a textbook, start with a game like Kerbal Space Program. And there have been a number of different research studies that have kind of proved out this idea. So as Kerbal is to rocket science, Roboco and Roboco Sports League, these 2 robotics games that we're building right now, are to robotics. So in Roboco, you're designing, building, testing, iterating on, and programming entirely virtual robots in order to solve complex, open-ended, and often very whimsical challenges. And the reason we made this game is we wanted to make robotics accessible to everybody in the world. The logic was essentially this. If anybody's familiar with Kai-Fu Lee's AI Superpowers, really good read about essentially the somewhat scary or somewhat exciting idea, depending on your perspective, that about half the current jobs will be usurped by machines in the next, I think he originally gave it like a 20-year timeline, and I think the book's about 5 or 6 years old. So essentially by the time my 9-year-old graduates from high school, we're projected to have about half of jobs be worked by machine learning algorithms or robots. So how do we prepare students for this type of future? Well, the answer is we prepare them by arming them with uniquely human skills, which I think are very similar, have a lot of overlap with 21st century skills, higher thinking skills, future-facing skills, a lot of different words for these types of skills, soft skills, procedural knowledge, but you sort of get the idea. So in other words, like the right side of this spectrum that we were talking about at the beginning of the session here. And so there's this question of our core school curricula essentially evolving fast enough to meet this need. And some people would argue that it is not, but that curricula surrounding programs like robotics, which is this superfood of 21st century skills, really nails this need, preparing students, which I think is just delightfully ironic that like doing robotics is a great way to develop the types of skills that you need in order to not be replaced by a robot when you're in the professional workforce. Of course, there are all kinds of challenges associated with robotics curriculum. The big one is cost. It's just really expensive to equip a class of students with physical robotics kits like Vex and Rev. The kits are awesome. And of course, physical robotics is absolutely fantastic. And I don't want you to interpret anything about this presentation as a disparagement of physical robotics. It's absolutely not. It's just that it's very expensive, so it's not necessarily accessible to everybody, or at least as many people as it should be accessible to. And then, of course, you add on top of that the idea of attending robotics competitions, which involves travel, and lodging, food, and all that kind of stuff. And now you're talking about potentially $30,000 to send a group of students to an event. And then, of course, on top of that, logistics, disease resistant, like it's very hard to do physical events in the midst of a pandemic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to walk through all of these advantages. Many of them you can probably imagine. But basically, even if there were no challenges with physical robotics, there are still lots of benefits and affordances that are unique to digital robotics. The very first one there is the one on here that I want to call out in particular, this idea of rapid prototyping. So I love the idea of people using a digital robotic solution paired with a physical robotic solution where they can prototype ideas much more quickly in the virtual space than they can in the physical space. So with this idea in hand, we went to the National Science Foundation and we asked for funding via an SBIR grant to build this robotics game for all. And they graciously awarded the funding. So we started to work in what's called phase 1 of the project. And in this phase, we worked with researchers from Intel to interview lots of robotics teachers and coaches in order to better understand what the value proposition of physical robotics kits was, so that we could try to make sure we captured as much of that as possible in the digital world. And the key measure of success, as far as all of them were concerned, for any robotics program is its ability to facilitate students' engineering design ingenuity, which I'm sure that varies from robotics teacher or coach from one to the next, but that was kind of the common thread that we saw across all of them. So that's exactly what we tried to target with Roboco. And I think this is maybe my trailer. I'm going to play a trailer real quick so you can get a sense of what this actually looks like. Let's see, you probably have to stop sharing. Okay, so you can see that we try to give the player a lot of, jump back to my presentation here, a lot of creative agency. And we also try to have a lot of fun with it, because part of our goal is to make the robotic space as unintimidating and inviting to people who have never built a robot before in their lives and maybe don't necessarily have a natural inclination toward robotics, but may discover they really enjoy it if there's a smoother on-ramp and a space that's a little bit more aesthetically inviting and playful. Okay. Yeah, so basically, as I mentioned in the game, players have access to this huge parts, this library of parts. They've got pistons and gears and rods and servo motors and all that kind of stuff, including both parts that are common in a physical kit. And of course, because it's digital, we can include parts that are too dangerous or expensive to use in the real world. And then people make all sorts of really cool things. This is...
What's up, guys? My name is Todd.
Let me turn the sound off there. So this is a streamer who likes to stream the game. He does a lot of sandbox building games. So he's playing this just for fun. And that's another part of our objective, is we want people to just do this for fun. And he picked up an early copy of the game, a pre-release copy of the game. And his objective in this particular stream was to build a realistic automobile chassis and suspension system. So we don't expect, if this is used in the classroom, for players to jump right in and be building things that are this complex. But we've created the system such that with the affordances that it facilitates this level of complexity for classrooms or educators or even just individuals who are willing and interested to go to this level of depth and complexity. Okay, so this is in my mind the good stuff, particularly going back to that spectrum that we were talking about in the beginning. This is kind of real life, these rich problem spaces. Ideally, they have infinite solutions. Players can iterate, players can experiment, and most importantly, they can innovate. That's exactly how we nail those skills that are going to be critical to the workforce of the future. And frankly, it's very difficult for other mediums, other static or passive reception mediums to accomplish this type of experience. Okay, so there's a sandbox mode in the game where players can essentially build without limits. You can think of this kind of like Legos, a box of miscellaneous Legos. And this is kind of for creative experimentation and exploration. And then these challenge modes that give the player a very specific challenge to solve. And then, of course, as I mentioned, those challenges have infinite solutions. There's no right answers. But the game does reward more elegant and cost-effective solutions that complete the objectives with minimal things like collateral damage. This is an example of a challenge where you have to cross a gap of goo to get to the other side and turn this valve off in order to stop this toxic goo leak. And then, of course, in addition to the main objectives, there's a bunch of different sub-objectives to give you a reason to build different types of robots each time you do it. This is an example of a different challenge where you get extra credit for sawing off these branches, which requires a different type of robot design than if you are just trying to fell these trees and get them into the truck. And then once again, there's lots of different sub-objectives to chew on if you want to get a little bit more in depth and involved. And this is a concept for an assembly line challenge that we're hoping to build in the future that requires Python programming to complete. So that's the other part of this, of course, is there's the mechanical engineering side, but then there's also the ability to program your robots to make them autonomous. This is an example of 5 different robots that were developed during a challenge that we did to accomplish a stair climbing task. And so you can see different players come up with entirely different solutions to these different types of challenges. So toward the end of our National Science Foundation grant, we were fortunate enough to broker a partnership with FIRST Robotics. Again, this would be a great opportunity to see how many people in the audience are familiar with FIRST, so I know how in depth to talk about it. But in short, they're basically an organization that does robotics as sport. So think of high school sports, but with robots and robot competitions instead of footballs and soccers. And FIRST has been achieving these really, really impactful and profound STEM outcomes for youth for decades in terms of youth going on to pursue college and career in STEM disciplines through this robotics as sport model. And our goal is basically two-part. We want to widen the top of the funnel, as it were, that leads to FIRST programming, and of course extend their programming into the digital realm. So that begs this question: what does it really look like when you have virtual robotics competitions like they do? So like robotics as sport, but virtual. And our answer, at least we suspect, is that it's going to look a lot like esports. So this was an example of the first online competition that we did around the experience. This was an ESPN style broadcast that we put together with MCs. We had 40 different teams from countries from around the world. And it was amazing in terms of the different types of solutions that people put together and the design and engineering ingenuity that was on display during the 3 rounds of this competition. But it was asynchronous because this is a single player experience. So basically teams submitted footage of their runs, and then we stitched them together during post-processing after the fact into a single stream and sort of broadcast it as if it was all happening at the same time, but in fact it wasn't. So we realized, of course, at this point that to realize this full vision that is espoused by FIRST and the types of events, the competitive events that they have, we really needed synchronous multiplayer, which is to say people playing the game at the same time in a live space against one another and sort of digitally embodied in the same virtual space at the same time. And so that is what led us to the Roblox platform. And that is where I will pass the mic over to Rebecca.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dan. I always just want to get in there and play with all of your robots every time, even though I see them frequently. Next slide, please. Great. So as I mentioned at the outset, Roblox is a global platform. We have millions of developers who create experiences on this platform for millions and millions of users to enjoy every day. And as you can see here, we have about 50 million folks right now who each day are exploring together, they're building new spaces together, they're experimenting together. And that's really what led us to think about how do we lean into some educational programming and content on Roblox? How do we motivate incredible educational developers to get involved in building for this ecosystem? So I'm going to just share a little bit more about Roblox at a high level, and then we'll go into a little bit more of our education vision, and we'll turn it back over to Dan to take us home. So Dan, next slide, please. So what is Roblox? Why is it so interesting? Roblox supports these different facets of kind of the metaverse and a gaming platform all in one that make it really sticky and really create a flywheel effect. The first is this concept of identity, which on Roblox really comes to life through an avatar. Young people in particular, I think, really see themselves in these 3D versions that they build of their avatar selves, where they get to customize and choose everything from their clothing to the type of creature or humanoid they are. There's just a high degree of autonomy, and we find that players build a really deep connection and really project their identity on that avatar that they select. The next thing that makes Roblox as a platform just really sticky and interesting is how often we see friends play together. Obviously, this was very pronounced during pandemic times, but we see it in general. People just really enjoy coming to a gaming platform that has a diverse array of content and being able to jump in and play a game together. We see this with grandparents and little kids. We see this with adults playing together. We see this with teens going to a concert on the platform together. So definitely that friends and multiplayer aspect is really key. The platform is also both very immersive and pretty low friction to jump right into. So it works on a wide range of devices, mobile, tablet, PCs, but it also supports pretty high quality graphics at this point with very realistic physics, very realistic materials engines, so it can feel very immersive. As mentioned, all of the content on Roblox is built by this community of creators, millions of folks who develop using Roblox Studio, the authoring side of the platform. So we have an enormous library of content, which is always changing, so there's always something new for folks to find. And the final thing I'll call out on Roblox, it's been really formative from our early days, is a major focus on our safety and civility and kind of this notion that everyone should be connected with a sense of optimism in the metaverse. So how do we leverage all of these incredible aspects of the platform to create a place that really brings out the best in folks and that allows for everyone to feel safe and secure and like they belong? Our economy is an interesting expression of this. We often pay out developers based on engagement, for example. So it's not just about how do you create, quick schemes of monetization in experience, but we also support this notion that a lot of folks might be seeking just great enjoyment, social experiences on the platform that maybe don't always have to monetize. And that's where Roblox, for example, with its economy, can choose to support that type of engagement as well. Next, please. So as we think about building this co-experience across billions of users, we see an obvious need to lean into the platform's potential to help folks learn and grow. Next, please. So Roblox Education has a large-scale vision that by 2030, we'll have about 100 million or so students learning with the platform every day. So how do we get from where we are now to there? Well, historically, Roblox has supported a lot of kind of organic or informal use of our Roblox Studio tool, again, the authoring side of our platform. It's a great tool for students to use who are learning computer science, who are interested in game design or game development, and by all means, we want to continue to support that type of learning pursuit using Roblox Studio. But we also recognized an opportunity for organizations like First Robotic and for developers like Filament Games who already had a vision for some type of STEM content or social studies content or social and emotional skills related content, whatever subject it might fall under, already had some vision for how to bring that into schools in a really meaningful way and how to leverage a game-based platform or a simulation-based platform or medium to do that. We saw an opportunity to offer grants to these tremendous organizations to help them kind of kickstart their development and learn about what it takes to build more multiplayer deep learning experiences on Roblox. So that's the focus of our education work. We're looking constantly to seed these phenomenal examples of students exploring together, practicing skills together, and learning together. Next, please, Dan. Thanks. So a few of our initial partners that I just want to call out, obviously today you're hearing about First and Filament, and you'll hear a little bit more about their early work. We also work with Project Lead the Way, who has a computer science module that's already in use in schools that uses Roblox Studio. You can see that in the center frame here. And then we made a grant to the Museum of Science Boston as well to support a mission to Mars journey. So I'll touch on each of these a little bit more. Go ahead, Dan. Great. So someone like the Museum of Science Boston is a great example of a potential partner who had just been looking for the right platform to develop a 3D immersive digital experience. They're very used to designing for 3D spaces, but this is the first time the Museum of Science has attempted to translate something really beyond the bounds of the museum walls and beyond its kind of engineering as elementary program that they supply curriculum through into schools that often leverages video. This is their first time going for something that's truly immersive, truly multiplayer. Next, Sam. Right. So the Museum of Science Boston had already done a lot of programming around Mars with their Destination Mars Omnifilm and planetarium experience. And they thought, what a natural next expression to bring this Mars content to the Roblox platform and think about offering students the chance to really behave as NASA scientists would. So imagine a group of students travel to Mars, they come to Mars, and it's their job then to figure out how do they survive on this planet? How do they get from point A to point B? How do they set up a camp or a habitat? Next, please. Great. And that was the impetus for the game that Filament and Museum of Science are together working on, this mission to Mars journey for students to do just that. Next, please. So in this experience, and Dan, you can totally talk about this more as well, but together the Museum of Science and Filament are envisioning a building lab, a building experience where students are building all sorts of different vehicles and rovers that are able to complete special journeys on Mars. So it might be navigating a dust storm, like on the next slide, hopefully on the next slide. There we go. So helping students anticipate, these different challenges and conditions unique to the Mars environment and figure out how to build different equipment and habitat environments that can withstand these different challenges. Next. We also think about how do we support life on Mars? How do students start to think about things like agriculture or vegetation? So these are all just areas, this is just concept art, but areas that together the Museum of Science and Filament are really working from a lot of the next gen science standards and working to incorporate in the knowledge, the skills, the practices, the habits of mind that undergird how scientists think today and how they might apply themselves to a novel situation like building on and living on Mars. Next. Just some more concept art for you guys to get a sense. Great. Great. Another partner who I called out before we turn it back over to Dan to talk a little bit more about their partnership is Project Lead the Way. So Project Lead the Way, as mentioned, is providing a computer science module. They're also working on a biomedical engineering experience on Roblox that really centers around the immune system. In case you're unfamiliar with Project Lead the Way is a great example of a large-scale STEM provider who pipes curriculum into just tens of millions of students a year. So you can see Project Lead the Way right now has these kind of pre-professional tracks that are included in the high school level all the way down to kindergarten. So Project Lead the Way launch is their kind of earlier program for younger students, and then their gateway program, maybe I flipped it actually, sorry. Their gateway program is for younger students, and their launch program is for slightly older students. But here's an example of kind of what they started with. So their game design and development module kind of used this little rover as an initial programming base where students would learn to navigate and traverse terrain that they would build out and modify in Roblox Studio. So this is a great example of something that an educational organization was just able to dive right in, start making use of Roblox's tools, and bring it right into classrooms. Next, please.
Awesome. Yep, and this is what Roboco Sports League looks like right now. So like Roboco, but again, sort of adapting the model of first live competitions into a sports league environment. So this is the result of our partnership with Roblox and First Robotics. And it's this sort of brand new version of the game that is critically is a multiplayer experience right out of the box, which essentially means that your robot is inhabiting the same virtual world as all the other robots in that space, like you can see in this screenshot. So this will be coming online toward the end of this year, and is going to be, if everything works out well, this evergreen platform for essentially 24/7 live synchronous digital robotics competitions and events. And then we'll have we'll also, on top of that, have official programming in partnership with First. These will be events that happen X number of times per year. The exact cadence is TBD, but essentially special events where teams will come together in order to compete for higher stakes and higher glory. So yeah, same thing, same model as with Roboco. So players are building custom robots to compete. The difference is that they're competing in these team-based sporting events with other Roblox players. I should have probably showed this slide earlier, but for anybody unfamiliar, this is what an actual physical live First robotics event look like. So they design these arenas that usually involve challenges like building a robot that can climb obstacles or shoot balls into holes or transport objects from one place to another. And actually it's a combination of multiple different objectives and sub-objectives that all get scored differently. So again, just think sports. And essentially in these areas, the players are building out their robots in order to solve these challenges. They're under quite a bit of time pressure. They have a certain number of weeks in order to build the robots, and then they advance from lower level competitions all the way up to nationals if their robots do well enough. And along the way, they're kind of iterating on their design in response to how it performs against other players on these challenges. First will make per league, there's 3 different leagues in First, and then First Global also has a separate league as well. They will do one challenge. They'll do one challenge arena per league per year, because these are quite an undertaking to create in the physical world. The process of designing them, iterating on them to make sure that they're fair and balanced, and then of course actually building them in the real world. By contrast, of course, in Roboco Sports League, we can build arenas really quickly and explore it, by which I mean like a month to 2 months per arena. And explore themes and gameplay mechanics that would be impossible or impractical in the real world. So for instance, this is a concept for a 3 versus 3 castle siege arena. Here's a totally different concept for an entirely different arena. We're hoping that we can get our arena development time down to a month or less once we're really in the swing of things, and maybe even potentially start deputizing some of the community to build their own arenas at a certain point and add them to the official mix. So it'll be a kind of a combination of cooperative and competitive challenges. We'll have some beginner and advanced challenges for smaller groups, challenges for larger groups, et cetera, et cetera. But I think most importantly, challenges that represent this diversity of gameplay types and play styles, so that there's something for everybody. This is the core gameplay loop in Roboco Sports League. So players come into the space, they select a game type. So it could be a soccer match, it could be herd all of the sheep, it could be siege the castle, whatever it is. We hope to have dozens and dozens of different types of matches and permutations on those match types over the years. But once they've selected a match, they will assess the nature of the challenge. They can practice in single player mode. They build their bespoke robot, and then they hook up with a team. This could be complete strangers. It could be people that they already know and know in the real world. They play a match, and then most importantly, based on the outcome of that match, they then have an opportunity to iterate on their robot design, improve for their next match in order to try to improve their performance. And so this core gameplay loop is very intentionally engineered to be analogous to the engineering design process and to mirror that process as much as possible. This is a sneak peek of what it looks like. I've been told that these videos are a little bit laggy, so I apologize for that in advance. I'm going to do the copy and paste method here in order to see if that improves things at all. 1 second. So I love there's one clip in particular of the soccer match, and the person has designed what looks like this totally overpowered goalie robot that when they hit the right button spreads these giant arms and blocks the entire goal. And I love that, because what we've started to see in the very early playtesting that we've done is somebody will create a robot that seems completely overpowered and sort of game ending because it's invincible, and then somebody else will come up with a design that trumps that design, and then we sort of see this arms race go on, where people respond to each other's designs and increase the ingenuity and the effectiveness of the designs in response to other players. And that's exactly what we were hoping would happen when we made this experience multiplayer. So that is really exciting to see. That brings us to the end of our remarks here. I've got a slide with a link. There we go. So that if you are an educator or robotics coach, or honestly, even if you're not, and you just want to play test the game, give us feedback, particularly if it's in regards to the use of the game in some sort of formal or formal adjacent informal context of education, we would love to have you participate. You can go to that link below in order to do that. That can be for either Roboco or Roboco Sports League, depending on which flavor is most applicable or of interest to you. And with the 8 minutes left, we will turn it over to question and answer, unless there was anything else you wanted to, any other final remarks you wanted to get in, Rebecca?
All good for questions. Thanks so much, Dan.
Cool. All right, the floor is yours. Okay, so first question. How could the robot games be combined with other education settings? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, obviously it depends on the type of education setting that the game is being combined with, but what we are hoping to do in the months ahead is develop some curriculum materials to pair with both experiences that'll make it that much easier to seamlessly integrate them into whatever engineering or design curriculum you already are enacting in your classroom, or your after school program, or your club, or what have you. One of the challenges that we have discovered so far when we talk to educators is that you don't get as much, it seems, because robotics is still somewhat nascent as an education topic, and a little bit peripheral to the core subject areas, like your reading, writing, arithmetic, etc., that implementation of robotics is very different in different areas of the country, different schools, different districts, different contexts. So one of the challenges that we have run into so far in trying to think about like the one universal curriculum to pair with these experiences to make them applicable to all educators in all contexts is that context just doesn't exist. That universal context doesn't exist. Sometimes it's taught as part of a physical science class. Sometimes it's a dedicated elective. Sometimes it's an after-school program, et cetera, et cetera. So I think one of the ways that we'll work to address that is to basically have some sort of plug and play curriculum for each of those different contexts. And then once the game is live and public and available to the games are live and public and available to everybody, we'll basically try to deputize educators that use the experiences and find really cool, innovative ways to use them, and ask them to help us build out share out some of the lesson plans that they've created that they found useful.
Thanks, Dan, for the answer and this incredibly interactive and engaging presentation. We have learned so much about Metaverse and Roblox and how robotic games can be made online versus in person, for people to really learn the procedural knowledge from really doing the setups. So I have a question from the attendees here. So far, where you're creating these platforms for people to use robotics, design robotics to kind of learn STEM, what are the biggest challenges you are facing, or you are seeing the students, the kids are facing when you're doing this?
On the other hand, we also have some digital constraints. Sorry, I was muted. That was a great question. Two big things come to mind. One is physics for sure. So there's no virtual space or game space where the fidelity of the physics can match the actual physics of the real world. And so things are going to behave a little bit differently than they do in the real world, and a little bit unpredictably in certain circumstances, especially when you start building really complex things. But the physics are a close enough proxy that they don't really get in the way of the engineering learning objectives in most cases. But that's one thing that we always have to grapple with. And then I would say the other thing is, because we are explicitly designing something that is meant to act as an on-ramp, and in fact to smoothen the on-ramp into a highly complex area, a topic that is valuable because it is complex. I find that there's, particularly when it's implemented in an EDU context as opposed to a consumer entertainment context, that there's sort of this expectation that it be relatively easy to pick up. And I think this is sort of an expectation that's very common for software in general, but particularly in EDU spaces. Whereas with physical kits, if anybody's ever tried to use a physical robotics kit, they're extremely complex. The instructions are usually pretty esoteric, and they take a long time. Just to like building your first robot is quite a significant challenge. It's quite a significant on-ramp to that. So I think part of the challenge with developing something that is complex and turning it into software and trying to capture what's valuable about that complexity, but at the same time make it as accessible as possible, is tricky, because there's less tolerance of like a learning curve when it comes to software as opposed to when it comes to hardware. So to mitigate that, we're just doing our best to try to include as much tutorialization as possible without making it feel like a really onerous process to have a win early on in the software, because that's a big part of what's important, I think, about turning robotics into software. In addition to making it accessible, the idea is that we also make it so that students have quick wins and are quickly engaged and excited about robotics.
Thanks for the answer. We have another question here. So we're wondering what kind of participant or people who are attending the robotic training or campaigns or matches, are those the same kind of people who are also doing the in-person matches, the in-person competitions, or are there new group of students or people who are interested in this? What are the demographics look like in the program?
It's definitely both. So everybody who's participating in First or First Global will have free access to all the software. Roblox is always free, by the way, but Roboco will have a fee, but it's always free to anybody who participates via First or First Robotic or First Global. And then in terms of demographics, so both games, so Roboco Sports League will skew a little bit younger in terms of the target audience than Roboco, just by virtue of the fact that the building mechanics in Roboco are a little bit more complex. But Roboco Sports League will be targeted that's like upper elementary, middle school, bleeding a little bit into high school. And then Roboco will be a middle school bleeding up into upper high school.
Yeah, thank you for the answers. Next question is...
Oh, and sorry, I forgot to say that even if you're not involved in First or First Global, you can still access both experiences. Both are open to the public and all schools and all educators.
Are there any big visions or next steps for Roboco to maybe attract more audience or step into more areas? Are there any big visions or next steps?
Yeah, the big mission is to really see if we can make digital robotics, as big as a popular esport, right? So for anybody who's familiar with esports, esports competition can draw huge crowds, pack stadiums, just like a real sporting event. And we're hoping that by making it highly accessible and highly scalable, that we can bring a level of audience, particularly through Roblox with its huge reach, that we can bring enough people into the space that a robotics competition online can be a really big deal that's attended by millions of fans potentially.
Yeah. We have one more question about the audience, the target. So we noticed that it's mainly focused on not kids but students. So are there any target at adults or any plans to expand this esports to adults? So we know as adults many people watch sports and they have digital gambling, they have digital games. But is there any plan to go into that area and make adults get addicted to this game as well?
Yeah, I mean, the cool thing about this game is, while our objective is to make robotics as accessible as possible, as you could hopefully tell from the videos, the building mechanics are really deep, right? So like if you strip away all the gameplay veneer, what you have underneath is something that's obviously not as powerful as CAD per se, but is pretty darn robust as a building tool in terms of like the level of player agency and the complexity of what you can build. And that will only increase as we add more tools to the game. Every new tool, every new part that we add to the game increases the number of permutations of what you can create. So because it has essentially unlimited depth, we're also finding that we get a lot of traction with adult engineers or people who are interested in engineering or sandbox play spaces or just creative play spaces, regardless of their age. So I think the upper bounds are really unlimited. The bounds are really only on the lower end, where I would say, some of the UX or some of the interaction gets probably a little bit too complicated for, say, like early elementary school.
Yeah. Do you think there's going to be any difference when it's targeting audience, like adults audience, than targeting people who are like mostly students?
Yeah, I mean, so the main difference, I think, is just how complex we make the challenges. And so that's one of the things that's really nice about Roboco and Roboco Sports League, is that we can, the experience of play for the player can be very different depending on how complex or how difficult the challenge space is. So right now in Roboco, we have 11 challenges. In Roboco Sports League, we're up to, I think, 4 or 5 or so at this point. By the time we launch, we hope to have double that. And as I mentioned before, the objective is to be able to crank them out relatively quickly, so we can get to the point where we're putting out maybe 6, 7, 8 or more new challenges every year. And every time we create a new challenge, we have our hand on that difficulty slider. And when we're thinking about attracting somebody who's younger, we can scale that difficulty back. And when we're thinking about attracting somebody to the space who's older, we can just increase it. So there's just a tremendous amount of flexibility there in terms of how we tune the game to different demographics.
Yeah. Okay. I have one final question. So, is there any way or any plan to probably incorporate the VR technology or AR technology to make the making of the robotics more real, or more existential, or so they can really have a hands-on experience without hurting their fingers or to carry anything? Is there any plan like that?
Totally. I love this question because it's a fun answer. So Roboco actually began as a VR project. When we originally applied for the National Science Foundation grant, it was to make robotics, to bring robotics to virtual reality. And in fact, it feels amazing to build robots with your hands. I use sort of the Lego analogy. And in fact, when you're working in VR, it does feel really cool. And when you piece blocks together, you can grab blocks and stretch them out with your hands, and everything feels pretty intuitive and pretty fun. So we are going to bring Roboco to the Quest 2 in the spring of next year. And then I guess I don't know that Roblox has made any official announcements about VR capabilities, and I suspect they're not ready to today. But I know in general that's where the metaverse is headed. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Yan, for the beautiful answers and also this very engaging presentation. I think we got all the questions. If you have a final remark and also tell people how to access the event or more about your company and organization, feel free to address those in like the next 5 minutes. Otherwise, we're done with the questions. And thanks so much.
Okay,
Thank
awesome.
you so much. Thanks for having us.
Yep, appreciate it. Thank you so much.